Hey there. With pitchers and catchers reporting this week, I thought it'd be a good idea to make a video recapping some of the notable free agency moves this offseason. With spring training rapidly approaching, this is the time where teams are getting excited for what the season might hold for them. Breakout performances, playoff hopes, and even World Series aspirations. The first move, which doesn't actually qualify as a move that truly kicked off free agency, was Steven Strasburg signing a 7-year, $245 million contract to stay with the world champion Washington Nationals. The Nationals made other moves throughout free agency, but none were as important as retaining their former number one overall pick from 2009. Not to mention those other moves that were made this offseason. With the huge contract awarded to Steven Strasburg, they could not retain Anthony Rendon. There was no way to replace the production that he gave them, but in their hopes to do just a fraction of that, the Nationals re-signed Howie Kendrick and Asdrubal Cabrera, as well as adding infielders Starlin Castro and Eric Thames. They've also added and retained some bullpen assistants with their signings of Kyle Finnegan, Will Harris, and Daniel Hudson. Oh, and they also re-signed Yan Gomes to continue to contribute as their 1-2 punch of Gomes and the ageless Kurt Suzuki. Oh, and one more thing, the aforementioned Anthony Rendon signed a 7-year, $245 million contract with the LA Angels. That number sounds familiar, doesn't it? The second big move that happened this offseason was Garrett Cole signing a 9-year, $324 million contract with the New York Yankees. Everyone was wondering where he would end up because we all knew that he wasn't going to stay with the Astros past last season. New York, surprise, surprise, was the highest bidder and won their race. Other than Cole, they were pretty quiet in this free agency with signing Chapman and Gardner to extensions. The next big name in a new place is Hyunjin Ryu, signing a 4-year, $80 million contract with the Toronto Blue Jays. Ryu is bringing with him his ability to shut down the opposing offense by posting a 2.21 ERA over the past 2 seasons, as well as pitching over 250 innings in each season. Adding to their need of starting pitching, they also added a pitcher out of Japan named Shun Yamaguchi. All we know about him is he spent 14 seasons with Japan pitching out of their bullpen and then to their starting rotation, and his best pitch is a splitter. Continuing with their trend of adding some serious starting pitching help, they added Chase Anderson and Tanner Roark. It appears as though the entire Blue Jays starting rotation will be acquired via free agency. Having Chase Anderson and Tanner Roark will at least give them some stability in the rotation, as they only had 3 starting pitchers have 100 innings pitched last season. The Philadelphia Phillies made a few splashes in this offseason. The most notable was signing Joe Girardi to be their new manager. There was some speculation of Girardi going on to coach the Chicago Cubs, but when they opted to sign a different manager, the Phillies were more than happy to add him to their staff. With Girardi comes a newfound faith of making the playoffs and making a serious run. The other notable free agent signings consist of Didi Gregorius and Zach Wheeler. Gregorius was hurt part of last year, and that injury he sustained will keep him out for the first half of this year. But let's not forget that the last 2 years before last season, he was an outstanding run producer on both aspects of that metric. Once he's healthy, he'll be able to assist their offensive efforts. But to win in this league, you need to be able to pitch nearly as good or better than you can hit, which is where Wheeler comes into play. One of the top 3 coveted starting pitcher pieces that the Mets were flaunting about over the last 2 years, he's a guy that takes the ball every 5th day and gives you his best effort every time. His numbers prove that. The Reds have been a team that have been very involved in this year's free agency. Their big splash came pretty recently with their addition of Nicholas Castellanos to the tune of 4 years, $64 million. That's a nice offensive addition that hit over 60 doubles last year for the Detroit Tigers and the Chicago Cubs to an already potent lineup. Another addition they made was some outfield help in the form of Japanese player Shogo Akiyama. Shogo is a bit older at 32 years of age, but he brings with him some solid defensive ability that they're looking for in center field. He was a 5-time All-Star in Japan with some sneaky power on the offensive side of the ball. The final player to note who signed with the Reds this offseason was Mike Moustakas, the longtime Kansas City Royal who spent the last 2 years on 1-year contracts with the Milwaukee Brewers while he was waiting for his long-term deal. He finally got one with the Reds. With signing a 4-year, $64 million deal, as I previously stated, the Reds are going to hit the ball this year, and Moustakas is definitely going to help. Okay, on to the bigger news that finally became official just over a week ago, Mookie Betts to the Dodgers. There were a few other components to this, like David Price going over there as well, and Boston agreeing to pay half of his remaining salary, but the big news is Mookie Betts. He's another dangerous weapon on that offense that doesn't seem as though they could get better, but then they do. The Red Sox received prospect Alex Verdugo and 2 more prospects for getting rid of the MVP and the veteran lefty. The Dodgers weren't done either. They also traded Kenta Maeda to the Twins for their prospect Brusdar Graterol. Last but not least, the final team that I will discuss is the Chicago White Sox and their moves that they made during this busy offseason. Their first deal of business was signing their all-star first baseman Jose Abreu to a 3-year contract, then signing Yasmani Grandal to be their starting catcher, trading for the power-hitting outfielder Nomar Mazara, then to their big free agent signing of Dallas Keuchel, their first big splash for a starting pitcher that they were desperate for. They also signed designated hitter extraordinaire Edwin Encarnacion, assumed backup catcher James McCann, and relief pitcher Steve Chiswick. Needless to say, they have been incredibly active in this year's free agency and are doing whatever they deem necessary to put a bow on this rebuild that they've been a part of. The hope is that more than half of these acquisitions pan out, and this team makes the playoffs for the first time in over a decade. Well, those are the more noteworthy moves that I thought needed to have some raised awareness on. I, for one, am very excited for the spring training and upcoming season. I'm interested in seeing how all these faces pan out in new places. Until next time, I'm Kevin Householder.